During the Civil War, the Air Force was born. And as early as 1898, the War Department showed interest in the glider. But it took a pair of clever bicycle makers who tinkered with a man-carrying kite to add imagination and power. Wilbur and Orville Wright gave the glider a water-cooled engine of their own design and two chain-driven 8.5-foot pusher propellers. The toss of a coin in 1903 at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, won Orville Wright the chance to be the first man in history to fly under power.
Air time, 12 seconds. Distance, less than the length of a B-36 wing.
Wilbur Wright went to Europe in 1908 to find a market for the flying machine, which up to then they were unable to sell. His flights on the continent attracted the President of France, as well as the kings of England, Spain, and Italy. To Wilbur, it was endless work. In addition to acting as pilot, he was ground crew, mechanic, and salesman. A team of horses pulled the plane to a wooden monorail. This was to serve as a runway on the grassy field. Lifted by a few men, the flying machine was swung into position facing the wind. To provide thrust for the takeoff, the Wrights had developed a weight-falling catapult. After the props were spun, the engine kicked over. Wilbur and his passenger, a French journalist, took seats on the lower wing and braced themselves for an exciting ride. He convinced Europe, winning applause, but no sales.
Back in America, encouraged by President Teddy Roosevelt, the War Department opened bids for a heavier-than-air flying machine. Signal Corps specifications required that it carry two persons a distance of 125 miles at an average speed of 40 miles an hour. The Wrights signed a stiff contract. Finally, at Fort Myer, Virginia, they flew a machine that was accepted as U.S. Army Airplane Number 1.
By 1913, 41 Army pilots were decorated with these gold military aviator wings. Among them was Lieutenant Henry Arnold, who later, as commanding general of the AAF, led 2.5 million airmen to victory. Another aviation pioneer, Glenn Curtiss, also built early Army trainers. Soon, more inventors improved the machine with tractor instead of pusher propellers, and the Army began to see the new airplane emerge as a weapon.
By 1916, our only trained aviators were a few Americans flying with France, and they made us proud. They were the famous Lafayette Escadrille, started by Norman Prince, William Thaw, Victor Chapman, and Bert Hall, who courageously fought when Germany had full control of the sky over Europe. When German U-boats forced us to declare war, American air power ranked 14th.
Believe me, we were far from ready. I was a rookie cadet, I ought to know. They gave us wooden guns and told us we were going to turn the tide. You know, in a couple of weeks, we began to look as though we might do it. For training equipment, we molded our own bombs out of plaster. Pretty soon, we trained with the real things, Lewis machine guns. Having met the requirements, we were issued leather flying togs and helmets. Assignments were made. We got a chance to fly. First, we made a pre-flight check of the baling wire planes. Then we tried our wings. "50 hours in the air, a few bombs. We were checked out, ready for advanced training overseas. America was producing airmen, but we didn't have a single fighting airplane. Only a few of our leaders were wise. Newton Baker, Secretary of War, was one. He insisted supremacy of the air in modern warfare is essential. Woodrow Wilson was another. The president asked for $600 million to meet the needs of military aviation. Meanwhile, Red Cross girls saw us off on our way overseas. Since Congress couldn't vote us time, we went to France without airplanes. But we did go in style. Camouflaged luxury liners like the Leviathan were used as troop ships. Some of us, half-trained flyers, went to Britain and Italy, but most of us went to France. There, we found cities of wooden barracks and muddy streets. In outdoor classes, we practiced gunnery. Wooden models helped us learn how to lead a plane with our fire. Battle-tested aviators took time out from the war to show us how to handle the stick. Finally, we soloed. The first ride was always a thrill and a bumpy experience. However, it was much easier to talk about turning the tide than to produce fighting aces overnight, even if some of us were lucky.
Late in 1917, France met the AEF's first Aero Squadron, commanded by Major Ralph Royce. His outfit was the first to see action, and they proudly pasted paper iron crosses over enemy bullet holes.
Our commander was Colonel Billy Mitchell. America's first flyers were there. General Benjamin Falloy in command of supply and schools. Colonel Thomas Milling, head of Air Service Units, 1st Army. And Colonel Frank Lahm for the 2nd Army, commanded by General Bullard.
When Major William Thor and the Lafayette Escadrille became the 103rd Aero Squadron, they brought a record of triumphs. Thor, 5 German planes down. Lieutenant Larner, 3. Lieutenant Merrick, 1. Lieutenant Tobin, 3.
Don't forget the aces. Captain Field Kindley with 12 victories, and Major Raoul Lufberry with 17, before they were both grounded forever. Then those who lived to take part in another war, Captain Elliot Springs with a score of 12, and the ace of aces, hat of the ring Captain Eddie Rickenbacker with 26 victories.
America's airplane factories and us war workers didn't get started until late. To make airplane wings, they took us house carpenters, furniture upholsterers, even seamstresses with high pompadours. Meet Rosie the Riveter, 1917. Painters used varnish that smelled like bananas. The fuselage, which we finally chose, was of British design. The engine was all American. Its manufacture was the outstanding production achievement of the war. In all, 4,500 DH-4 airplanes powered by the Liberty engine were put together in this country. They were built by Ford, Lincoln, Cadillac, and Packard, automobile manufacturers. Curtiss, Martin, and Wright, still famous plane-making names, were busy assembly plants in those days. World War I gave America its great aircraft industry. Each plane was test-flown. Then, the thousands of parts were painstakingly dismantled for packing under guard. Crated and addressed, it was off to the front.
In France, husky mademoiselles handled the wings like toys. Here, parts were reassembled into the fighting craft, which helped sweep the enemy out of the sky. May 1918, and the first American DH-4s rolled directly from assembly sheds to the airfields. Only 8 months after they were ordered into production, they joined American aviators ready for the big push.
When the order to prepare for battle was given, truckloads of aerial bombs were delivered to the planes. There, armorers fused the bombs and loaded the racks. Then the boys who had to take them up made sure the job was done right.
The boys still talk about the big push. When we lifted the flaps that September morning in 1918, everything was ready. Billy Mitchell had asked for every Allied airplane that could fight, and we brought them out. The brass ordered a tremendous air force to control the skies over the Samahil sector. This was the First Army's field of battle. For the dawn takeoffs, we put flares on our wingtips. Every Allied field on the continent gave its planes. General Mitchell called for 1,500. We actually got 1,481 off the ground. Wooden props spit into the air, and the engines began to rev up. Our mission was to protect the doughboys of the First Army. Some had orders to bomb and strafe enemy installations, others to engage the Germans in the air. This was it.
Each pilot had been carefully briefed for his part in the mission. U.S. aviators in 609 American planes, now a solid part of Allied air power, rose to attack. Germany put Albatrosses, Fokkers, more than 30 different types of planes in action to fly no man's land patrols. Some of the Huns dropped bombs by hand on our troops.
With over 120 different types of aircraft, the Allies fought back. Our boys were always quick to single out the enemy and come in close to attack. The German was hurt. He tried to escape, but couldn't make it. Our pilot signaled that he had made another kill. And after a victory roll, he rejoined his buddies. Other enemy ships strafed our observation balloons, burning them out of the sky.
Allied air power struck back in force. The sky was a beehive of battle. We overwhelmed their air defense, winning and holding air superiority. It was almost the same a few weeks later in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where we bombed with telling effect in the most notable aerial effort of the war. November 11, 1918, closed a chapter in the unending story of the United States Air Force. Visual history has shown us some of the courageous men in uniform and out who cradled the dream of flight and gave us aviation. In the history-making jobs that lay ahead is the inspiring chronicle of more Americans who continued the pioneer spirit. Men with an idea who planned and worked and fought to build the greatest striking force and protective power in history, the United States Air Force.
November 11th, 1918. Everyone celebrated the armistice in the Times Squares of the world. While victory flags still waved, America cut the Army Air Service 95%, making it a skeleton force. In France, our airmen had earned the admiration of the Allies, but economy only permitted a handful to rejoin the post-war ranks. Fortunately, among them were Mitchell, Brereton, Spaatz, Arnold, and other future Air Force leaders. Many airmen, such as Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, left the service and adjusted themselves to the rigors of civilian life. A few became world famous, like Air Captain Fiorella LaGuardia. For those who stayed in, there was immediate need for their activities. To inaugurate the U.S. Airmail Service, which was pioneered by the Army, President Wilson escorted the First Lady.
The Postmaster General picked one of us Army pilots to be the first to fly the mail. For the benefit of the Red Cross, the President had addressed a letter to the Postmaster of New York City. Witnesses watched the famous first airmail letter being posted. Lack of instruments and navigation maps made flying tough, but we hoped jobs like this would increase public confidence in our ability. With the mail sacked up and ready to go, Wilson and the pilot discussed the proposed flight. Meanwhile, the 4 mail sacks were stashed away in the open cockpit under the president's friendly gaze. Then the pilot climbed aboard, little dreaming that less than 22 miles from Washington he'd get lost. Later, the first airmail was delivered by another pilot who followed the railroad tracks to New York.
Another Army assignment for men who stayed in uniform was Forest Fire Patrol. Quick detection brought about important savings in the nation's timber. But in those days, the one who most often captured the public's eye was the war-trained flyer who took up barnstorming. With a $50 surplus trainer and a complete disregard for the law of gravity, he worked in a drafty office only a few seconds a day. To wildcats like Howard Hawks, Roscoe Turner, and Stinson goes much credit for introducing America to the sky. Even the obsolete pusher, condemned by the Army before the war, helped popularize aviation, develop airfields, and add to the knowledge of flying. The crowds loved to watch the daredevils outdo each other with spectacular stunts. The steady-flying, easy-to-handle Jenny, standard Army trainer, was the barnstormer's favorite perch. Although some of the more reckless civilian flyers gave aviation a black eye, most of them helped America lead the world toward the air age.
Wherever there was business enough, the gypsy flyer settled down. He bought a bigger plane, rented a larger cow pasture, and often gave free rides, especially to the ladies. Rides with every modern convenience. Eventually, there grew up the private intercity taxi services which flew millions of miles, direct ancestors of today's big commercial lines.
After the war, Congress set up the Air Service as a permanent combat element and permitted training to start again. We studied aerial photography. As the eyes of the Army, one of the Air Service's primary missions was reconnaissance. The main tool was a high-speed aerial camera. After the pictures were taken, the glass plates were developed. Then a lab man made contact prints. Finally, these overlapping pictures were cut up and pasted down as a mosaic. Some of us were briefed for our first mission, strafing maneuvers. This strafing mission was against ground troops armed with anti-aircraft. With the help of the ground crews, we started the takeoffs. Still based on wartime practices, the training program was in 3 parts: primary, basic, advanced. In advanced, we specialized in bombardment, observation, pursuit, or attack. When they heard our engines roar, the troops ran for cover. Flying through their anti-aircraft fire, we strafed the enemy. A mule-drawn ack-ack blazed away.
The Army maintained an active, though limited, interest in a lighter-than-air program. At a school in Scottsfield, Illinois, men trained for work with free as well as semi-rigid balloons. AEF success with observation blimps inspired Army interest in non-rigid and semi-rigid airships for 20 years into the future. Air Service Chief General Charles Menaher took pride in showing flight training to General Reed, Commandant, 5th Army Corps. Together, they watched Major Carl Spott signal 18 pursuit crews to prepare for a mass graduation review. This was the big moment after more than a year of the toughest training in the world. As the newest members of the Air Service, they took off to do their part in building America's early air power. It was a magnificent sight to see these squadrons take possession of the air.
Flying safety was a constant goal, and development of a life-saving parachute which the early birds could trust was high on the list of equipment being researched. This test called for jumping off the wing backwards. Another method was having the slipstream open the chute and yank a man off the wing. Although parachutes had been offered by the Service of Supply for some time, our men didn't use them. To prove that the equipment worked, many of the test jumps were made by the inventors themselves.
Despite budget setbacks, the Air Service continued to make aviation history with record-breaking flights. Lieutenants Kelly and McCready won congratulations from the Dean of all flyers, Orville Wright, for setting several duration and distance records in the famous T-2, a hot ship. For the first non-stop coast-to-coast flight, the Air Service modified a giant commercial transport with special tanks in the wings. This was the third try by the same men in the same plane. 2 previous west to east hops had failed. In preparing the plane, 780 gallons of gas were pumped aboard. By flying from east to west, they hoped to use up most of the gas load before climbing the Rockies. This was not a stunt. John McCready and Oakley Kelly were part of a larger Army program to develop better planes, engines, and navigation, and to advance flying techniques. As the prop was spun, history took note of May 2nd, 1923, as a memorable day. One of the tensest moments was the takeoff. Would the monoplane, now weighing 10,000 pounds, clear the Curtiss hangars at the far end of the field? It did. Throughout the 2,250-mile route, the pilots took turns at the controls. Average speed, 94 miles an hour. Less than 27 hours later, the T-2 arrived over Rockwell Field, San Diego. After spanning a continent, the huge plane and its 2-man crew settled down to Earth. And the single Liberty engine now taxied the T-2 on California soil toward the excited crowds. By covering the greatest distance ever made in a single cross-country flight, Kelly and McCready proved that eventually, in a national emergency, troops could be transported from one coast to another in little more than a day.
In the early 20s, chief proponent for the value of air power was Brigadier General Mitchell. Since his return from France, he had insisted that an airplane could sink any surface ship. And when he argued that 1/2 the cost of a single new battle wagon could supply the planes to make the warship obsolete, Congress insisted he get the chance to prove it. For the tests, Billy Mitchell hastily assembled a force, including some Navy flyers, which he trained at Langley Field, Virginia. He taught them the same bombing techniques which he had learned in World War I. Engines were started, and the 1st Provisional Air Brigade took off for a mission which was to test the future of military aviation. Fast pursuit and heavy bombers, accompanied by auxiliary planes with cameras and observers, headed for the latest target, a U.S. battleship. By new tests conducted on the obsolete Alabama, Mitchell tried to clinch his claims. Through the use of phosphorus bombs, he demonstrated the fine art of precision bombing. A perfect hit. This was expert pinpoint bombing. Heavier bombs were now prepared by the armorers of the Air Brigade, and the SS Chalmette radioed orders for the new takeoffs. Power men signaled the heavy bombers, and again they displayed the same remarkable precision. But the Joint Board was still unconvinced even when more bombs finally sank the Alabama.
2 years later, Billy Mitchell and his men prepared for a new series of battleship bombing tests, this time against the obsolete battle wagons, New Jersey and Virginia. On the deck of the San Miguel were General Pershing, Admiral Shoemaker, Assistant Secretary of War Davis, and the new Air Chief, General Patrick. The 1923 tests attracted even more widespread public and official attention.
The target sat and waited for a 2,000-pound bomb to be dropped from 10,000 feet. The Air Service was learning that a near miss was the body blow that weakened the hull, setting up a target for the knockout punch. Mitchell's Air Brigade was becoming more and more expert and could lay those eggs anywhere. A photo plane recorded everything on film. The beginning of the end of a mighty warship victim of precision bombing. A direct bomb strike had cleared the decks and armor plate buckled like a tin can. By showing her keel, the Virginia proves she's had enough. And she's on her way to join the other test victims, German sub U-117, destroyer G-102, light cruiser Frankfurt, and battleship Ostfriesland, as well as U.S. battleships Alabama and New Jersey.
Air power versus sea power. The tests were a brilliant success, even if many years were to go by before their significance was fully appreciated. For 10 years after the armistice, the job handed America's Air Service was a secondary one, support of the ground forces. Although later chapters in the Air Force story show that growth of the nation's air arm was inevitable, skeptics persisted in trying to stop progress. Thus, it was a slow and difficult climb to be allowed a more positive role in national defense, and eventually to prove, like Billy Mitchell did, the power punch of strategic bombardment and the peace power of the United States Air Force.
1924. The entire nation, as well as the crowds in Boston Harbor, waited to cheer the first round-the-world flyers. The U.S. Air Service, struggling with a few men, a handful of planes, and very little money, hoped these spectacular achievements would help win public support. Even though it took 6 months for the sturdy biplanes to circle the Earth, the Air Service was making a victim of space. Traversing more than 27,000 miles, they had flown through every weather on Earth. The conquering heroes, led by Lieutenant Lowell Smith, succeeded where all others had failed and at long last returned home. These 6, Harding, Nelson, L.P. Arnold, Wade, Ogden, and Smith, together had reduced the size of the Earth under the leadership of Mitchell and General Patrick, new Chief of the Air Service.
At the same time, we developed the Barling bomber. For crew, we had pilots Lieutenants Harris and Muir Fairchild, the designer Barling and engineer Culver. They climbed through the hatch of the monster, which had been shipped to Wright Field in sections. These men were taking a big step toward realizing Billy Mitchell's strategic bombing theories. From his open cockpit, the commander surveyed the man-of-war and ordered his crew chief to start the 6 Liberty engines. 4 of these were tractors, while 2 worked as pushers. With everything checked, the pilot gave the signal to taxi toward the takeoff point on the grassy runway. The Barling had 3 wings, which spanned 120 feet, and it stood 27 feet high, dwarfing all Air Service planes of the time. Meet the Super Dreadnought, biggest attempt at a long-range load-carrying heavy bomber. In fact, this was the largest ever built in the United States up to then. During construction, it raised many eyebrows because the plane cost somewhere near $500,000. A very high cost for a new airplane idea when the total Air Service budget was so small. The experimental triplane clumsily started its takeoff for the first time in 1923. 32,000 pounds traveling along at the incredible speed of 61 miles an hour. When it couldn't climb over the Appalachian Mountains, the Barling was grounded and was used to solve engineering problems. It certainly influenced development of the B-17.
The next year, President Coolidge looked for the Pan American Goodwill Flyers to land at Bowling Field, Washington. After they had flown 22,000 miles and had visited 25 sister republics, Major Herbert Dargiel and his crew were welcomed back to the U.S. The President awarded each flyer a Distinguished Service Cross certificate in a ceremony attended by the Cabinet. The new Air Corps chief congratulated the flyers, including future Air Force generals Lieutenant Ennis Whitehead and Captain Ira Aker. Thus, the Air Corps had demonstrated its diplomatic value to the nation.
Also in 1926, Frederick Patterson, head of a group of Ohio businessmen, broke ground for Wright Field. 2 years later, Orville Wright raised the flag for our dedication ceremony in a distinguished company of many notables and aviation names. Together, they hallowed the ground for the Air Corps Materiel Division, which was going to build the greatest flying field in the world, near Dayton, home of aviation. America couldn't have had better representation than Orville Wright, Secretary of War Davis, Judge Kennesaw Landis, Assistant Secretary Truby Davison, Air Corps Chief General Patrick, and many others. From the steps of the new headquarters, they witnessed the gun salute. Squadrons of the latest planes passed in review and hailed Wright Field.
Another distinguished Army flight was the first non-stop attempt from California to Hawaii. Ground crews carefully prepared the huge tri-motor Air Corps monoplane called the Bird of Paradise. She was going to fly an untried course mapped out by Lieutenants Maitland and Hagenberger. Oakland airport crowds applauded the two Army flyers as they gunned their engines and started off down the long runway. Hundreds of gallons of gas made a heavy and dangerous load. Finally, the Bird of Paradise lifted itself off the earth and headed for 2,400 miles of nothing but ocean. Navigation was the chief problem. Using instruments he had designed and developed himself, Hagenberger guided Maitland straight to their goal, an island in the vast Pacific. Less than 26 hours later, the people of Hawaii hurried to get a look at the first airplane flown from the States. Maitland and Hagenberger had made it. Seems that almost everyone in Honolulu came out to say aloha to the two tired but happy men who had spanned the Pacific. This was later regarded as the most perfectly organized and completely planned flight ever attempted. Hagenberger and Maitland triumphantly returned to the States by boat.
In the 20s, the Army watched Americans stunt flying the oceans. Charles Lindbergh, Will Rogers and Wiley Post, Amelia Earhart, and many others. The Air Corps learned from successes as well as failures, like this overloaded civilian takeoff. Luckily, Ruth Elder and a pilot were only slightly injured.
In the search for greater range, very important to air defense, we sent up the famous question mark to try mid-air refueling, another in the Army's never-ending chain of experiments. The idea was as simple as tapping a beer barrel at 70 miles an hour. First, the tanker plane let down a gas line. After a crewman aboard the question mark caught the hose, contact was made. This was done 43 different times in order to transfer 40 tons of gas, oil, food, batteries, and supplies. 9 of these delicate contacts were made at night. In all, 5,660 gallons of gasoline and 245 gallons of oil were transferred by this air-to-air refueling method. After completing a transfer, the question mark threw off the gas line, which was then pulled back into the tanker plane. The experiment continued successfully for nearly a week, breaking every endurance record known. When the question mark finally came down, it proved that a plane could fly 11,000 miles without stopping, and that U.S. Air Corps flight training was the best. Major Carl Spaatz and his crew, including 2 other future Air Force generals, were the champion endurance flyers of their time. This was the beginning of the idea that the Air Corps could deliver a payload anywhere on Earth. Even in 1929, the United States Air Arm had shown that strategic operations could be extended to cover half the globe. The question mark's engine showed only trivial wear. If it hadn't been for a plugged grease outlet, Who knows how many more days they could have stayed aloft. The rugged five-man team was made up of Staff Sergeant Huey, Lieutenant Pete Quesada, Lieutenant Harry Halverson, Captain Ira Aker, and Major Carl Spotts. With questions answered, the question mark returned to its hangar.
Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Royce, during the severe winter of 1930, led the 1st Pursuit Group, flying Curtiss Hawks through 3 weeks of exercises in sub-zero temperatures. This was a large-scale operation. For many years, the Air Corps was seriously engaged in cold weather tests for its men and machines. Their concern was with the ice-bound approaches to the American continent. Airplanes had already crossed the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. Eventually, why couldn't enemy aircraft follow the icy meridian straight over the top of the Earth? Just before one mission, a blizzard hit, freezing up the engines. The men found the crankcase oil became a solid mass. Maneuvers such as these demonstrated the vital need for a cold weather testing program. Skis were welded to the ice. Nevertheless, the crews persisted and they got the planes ready to fly. Under the most difficult field conditions and working in frigid temperatures without de-icers, without electrically heated suits, and in open cockpits, the Army Air Corps trained to defend America.
American air races started in 1920 and continued to focus public attention on flying for 19 years. Remember the 1925 Pulitzer contest? Our entry was a Curtiss Hawk. General Patrick instructed Lieutenant Bettis as Jimmy Doolittle looked on. The Navy's entry was the same, except for the paint job and the pilot. Lieutenant Al Williams held the speed record and was confident of success. Bettis was the first to take off. On another section of the field, the ground crew straightened the Navy plane and Williams sped away. There goes the Army. It was a spectacular show around a closed course as Bettis picked up speed. First he equaled Williams' old record, then he went even faster. Williams dished out tough competition. Even before Bettis came in for his landing, everyone knew that the Army had won. The new speed king of the year was Cyrus Bettis, who averaged 249 miles an hour. The Navy entry averaged 242 miles an hour and was given second honors.
2 weeks later, in the Schneider International Seaplane Race at Baltimore, Army was represented by Lieutenant Jimmy Doolittle. The Navy was in this one, too. They both flew Hawks fitted with floats. Britain entered a Napier. Italy, a Machi. The float planes took to the sea. Doolittle was the first to respond to the signal. In the face of top-notch competition, Army was the first to cross the finish line, a 232-mile-an-hour winner. Cleveland Air Race crowds loved the Army maneuvers. The 1st Pursuit Group and the 17th Attack Group in spectacular operations. Lucky Lindy watched the Army write its initials in the sky.
During the 20s, the Air Corps proved the airplane was more than a weapon. Although Army flyers had cut time and distance by flying higher, longer, and faster, this period was a constant struggle for recognition. These flights made Americans think about air power. Later chapters in the Air Force story will show the growing importance of the air arm for national defense. The uniting of the new power with America's great industrial capacity made it possible to prepare for the future and to speed the growth of the United States Air Force. 1930. Randolph Field was dedicated and a new Air Corps era began. One of the Army's first pilots, General Frank Lum, received congratulations as father of the West Point of the Air. It soon developed into one of the greatest air bases in the world. To this $10 million Texas Air City came headquarters for the Air Corps Training Center. Randolph eventually became the concrete nest where many of America's World War II Eagles learned to fly.
We held large-scale maneuvers in 1931 over the northeast quarter of the nation. Veteran flyer General Benjamin Floyd, who was to be named Chief of the Air Corps before the year was out, announced that this was the greatest concentration of Army Air Corps planes ever attempted. We had brought to Dayton, Ohio, almost 700 Martin, Keystone, and Curtiss two-engine bombers, backed by squadrons of swift Boeing P-12 Pursuits. For a 9-day period in successful combat maneuvers, air crews practiced with all types of military aircraft, flying almost 2 million air miles. Outside San Antonio, Texas, the 3rd Attack Group, one of Hoyt Vandenberg's early outfits, developed techniques to destroy enemy planes on the ground. For targets, they used Weary Willies, a polite name for worn-out and obsolete aircraft. Each Keystone dropped a string of 3 bombs. The lesson: enemy planes destroyed on the ground can never menace the skies.
During the early 30s, President Hoover came to Bowling Field to decorate an ace. Air Corps Chief General James Fichet read the citation honoring Captain Eddie Rickenbacker for his heroism 12 years before in the battle skies over France.
For 2 other heroes, the Air Corps dispatched a non-rigid airship to salute a majestic monument rising from a stone star on the highest of the Kill Devil Hill, among the sand dunes near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Man's first successful flight was thus fittingly dedicated with a wreath from the sky. Here, the history of man's conquest of the air was inscribed in bronze and granite. At Washington ceremonies, only one brother was alive to hear the Distinguished Flying Cross citation read by Assistant Secretary of War Truby Davison and to receive the certificates from Secretary of War Dwight F. Davis. Orville accepted for Wilbur as well as himself. Together, they had built a machine which influenced the course of history.
While America engaged in peaceful pursuits, on the other side of the globe, the Japanese military machine was preparing for war. Her Army and Air Force swarmed over Manchuria, and aggression exploded. Japanese airplanes and ground troops in the fall of 1931 began an unwarranted attack on Manchuria, the beginning of world conflict.
In the States, we agents of the Indian Bureau had asked the War Department to help us get food to the snowbound Navajo tribes in Arizona. The 11th Bomb Squad came to us from March Field. After the flyers wrapped the supplies in blankets and fastened them to the bomb shackles, they hung the Mercy bundles inside the planes like bombs. Near a line of Curtiss bombers, we pointed out the first trading post on the map. The pilots called it the target. It was easy to see that this winter of 32 was a man-killer as we flew north past Navajo Mountain, traveling 133 miles an hour in open plains at 0 temperatures. We searched the mesa. There it is, the big lodge in the middle of the stake fence. Flying low, the pilot put the B-2 Condor on the bomb run. Skimming over the foothills, it felt like we'd surely graze those trees on the ridge. There go the Mercy bombs. It was magic. Machines designed for killing an enemy were saving our friend. We almost tripped on our own shadow as we waved goodbye and headed back. Agents on the scene reported that by dropping 15 tons of supplies, the Air Corps had saved entire families. Our aviators engaged in peaceful pursuits. At the same time, there were war rumblings in Europe. While we flew missions of mercy, an ominous voice was threatening the peace of the world.
Vor uns liegt Deutschland, in uns Marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland!
Many of us in America had made the mistake of laughing at this Adolf Hitler. From 1933 on, his leaders made their party day in the city of Nuremberg a tremendous spectacle. The Nazis had finally come into power. These very same kids were to face Allied armies, navies, and air forces only a short time later. Within 6 years, as Germany's Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, they threatened the freedom of all the world.
Back home in 1934, there was a conflict over charges that the United States Post Office Department was paying exorbitantly high rates to commercial lines for carrying the nation's airmail. Contracts were canceled, and by presidential direction, Postmaster General James A. Farley signed the order turning the job over to the Army Air Corps, which had pioneered flying the mail. In obsolete planes, including open cockpit fighters and trainers, we maintained day and night airmail schedules. In spite of weather and the lack of equipment, the men of the Air Corps tackled the job as though flying the mail was a series of combat missions. Operating from airfields which still used World War I searchlights and flying without a beacon system, crashes were inevitable. The nation wondered how the Air Corps could ever carry bombs if it couldn't carry mail. But investigations disclosed that if we had been given the planes, personnel, and training funds for which we battled all those years, we could have done this or any job.
The 30s also began to see a change in Army aircraft design. Sleek monoplanes, all-metal construction. General Falloy had urged the aviation industry to compete in the building of a fast bomber. And Boeing delivered the 163-mile-an-hour B-9. The same year, Boeing took a powerful 600-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine and strapped on a rugged 24-foot saddle. They called the result a P-26. These first all-metal pursuit monoplanes were still on hand 9 years later when the Philippine Air Force tried to use them against the Japs. Pitted against the B-9, the Boeing fighter and bomber put each other through their paces. Kicking up a top speed of 230 miles an hour, it easily outstripped the B-9 bomber and many other planes of the period. Another entry in the bomber competition was Martin's early version of the B-10, also a twin-engine, all-metal monoplane. It had a waist gun, a nose gun, and an efficient bomb bay which could close on a 2,000-pound argument. This armament, plus a 1,300-mile range, made it the most powerful bomber of the time, while its speed of 207 miles an hour made it the fastest in the world.
An excellent trial for the new B-10s came in 1934 when Lieutenant Colonel Hap Arnold and Majors Hugh Nur and Ralph Royce led 27 officers and men on a long-range test flight. Takeoff, Washington, D.C. Destination, Fairbanks, Alaska. Mission, to fly over extensive Alaskan territory, photograph strategic landing areas, determine the feasibility of sending an Air Force to Alaska in an emergency, and report on frontier defense. On the return trip from Juneau to Seattle, the crews flew non-stop through fog and rainstorms, 990 miles. Thus, as early as 1934, the Air Corps proved that it was technically possible for an enemy to bomb the United States from the Arctic. After reaching Washington, the Alaskan flyers were honored at Bowling Field. Later, in new trials, the Army Air Corps set out to prove that B-10s could operate under extreme Arctic conditions.
During back-breaking exercises, picked crews battled freezing equipment as they tried to operate their planes and weapons in sub-zero temperatures. Lessons learned in these cold weather tests proved invaluable 7 years later when Japan reached for the United States via Alaska. While the new bombers had, in a sense, moved America's frontier to Alaska, they also demonstrated that should the need ever arise, this same frontier could receive aid by air.
At West Point, where the Army's future officers were schooled, the only flight training for cadets up to June 1935 was the time they put in flying over the hurdles during cavalry maneuvers. But the class of 36 was the first to start aviation indoctrination. To Mitchell Field, New York, came 279 cadets in 3 separate groups, under command of Air Training Officer Major Omar N. Bradley. Each group prepared to stay a week to get 20 hours of flying, along with extensive ground courses from Army and Air Corps experts like Air Officer Lieutenant Colonel Walter H. Frank. In this first detachment were future Colonels Richard Carmichael, Clinton True, Gordon Austin, and Benjamin Davis, among others. They studied aircraft familiarization, gunnery, and engines. Before long, orders of the day called the names for the first flight. Down the line went the cadets, trailing their waltzing Matildas. Engines were warming up as the cadets climbed aboard, bucking the slipstream. Pilots took the controls, and the line of obsolescent LB-6 bombers taxied off the hard stand. At Mitchell, the runway was a cleared field where the big planes formed a huge oval, treating the West Pointers to an Air Corps dress parade prior to taking off. After flying over New York City, the lead Keystone bomber headed due north toward the point. Gunnery familiarization was on the curriculum, as was instrument reading, cross-country, formation flying, and avigation. En masse, the 3 flights roared up the Hudson River to salute the United States Military Academy at West Point.
For the years between wars, the Army Air Corps continued to make progress, and U.S. Army Chief of Staff reports began to attach greater importance to military aviation. Squadrons exercised as real fighting units, with the General Staff finally conceding that the Air Arm might be utilized for independent operations. As the next film chapter will show, hopes of big bomber advocates boomed during a period of alarming developments on the world scene. In this prelude to war, weapons for American defensive strength and long-range striking power were being developed and proved by the United States Air Force. 1935. Diamond Head on the island of Oahu became the visual checkpoint for Hickam, a new Army field which was dedicated that spring. It was not until 1937 that Hickam was built up as a major air depot and homing station for a complete wing. Situated at the entrance to Pearl Harbor, this field became Air Defense Center of Hawaii. After 20 years, the War Department had finally given these volcanic islands recognition as an overseas garrison. Eventual home for the Hawaiian Air Force, the Pacific Paradise easily won a reputation among airmen as being a good deal.
When the volcano Mauna Loa on Hawaii suddenly became active, the government called on the Army Air Corps to bomb the lava flow and try to save Hilo City. We still welcomed every chance to serve the public and win their support. The antique bombers were gassed up and the bombs were fused, ready for the operation. Then the towerman gave us the takeoff signal. 5 Keystone bombers of the 5th Composite Group, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Asa Duncan, headed for the target, a river of fiery lava which relentlessly flowed 800 feet an hour toward the city. Correcting his sights, my bombardier signaled for release of the first bomb. In all, we smashed 6,000 pounds of high explosives at the lava stream and its source. Within 2 days after the bombing, the river of fire slowed, then stopped completely. And Hilo City was saved by air power.
March 1935, General Orders established the GHQ Air Force, an important advance. This meant that a large part of national defense was entrusted to the Air Corps' handful of men, although they constituted only 11% of total U.S. Army strength. The plan was under command of Air Pioneer Brigadier General Frank Andrews, who announced that GHQ had set up 3 combat wings bedecked in camouflage. One at Langley Field, Virginia, for the east, one at Marchfield, California, with aerial forces to protect the west, and one at Barksdale Field, Louisiana, ready for any emergency. Thus, the nation was provided with small mobile air forces, theoretically capable of spotting and intercepting an enemy before he could get within striking distance. And if necessary, planes could be dispatched to reinforce American bases in Hawaii, Panama, or Alaska.
Under GHQ, the role of aircraft in coastal defense was also recognized. We helped Andrews, a flying general, prepare to beat the Lindbergh record by using a Martin B-12, fitted with flotation gear. 2 1,100-pound bombs served as payload for the speed test over the 621-mile course. A pair of supercharged 750-horsepower engines easily lifted the huge amphibian off the bay. Flying from Langley Field, Virginia to Bennett Field, New York, and return, Army engineer timekeepers tracking the entire flight clocked Andrews at 165 miles an hour, whereby he established 3 new world records for seaplanes and advanced American air power.
In the interest of scientific research, an historic flight was made on Armistice Day, 1935, from the Stratobowl in South Dakota. Jointly sponsored by the Army Air Corps and the National Geographic Society, the world's largest balloon was made ready by an army of soldiers, technicians, and scientists. This was to be the climax to years of work by men like Dr. Lyman Briggs, Air Corps Chief General Oscar Westover, and Captains Albert Stevens and Orville Anderson. It was a proud moment for the 3 Army airmen. Shortly before the ascent, Stevens joined Anderson inside the 9-foot sphere to check the ton of delicate scientific instruments which they had installed to investigate the sky. They carried cameras, a spectrograph, a radio transmitter, even Geiger counters. Within a necklace of floodlights, the giant mushroom was filled with helium gas. 0 hour and all aboard. Attaching the sphere to the fully inflated and rising balloon was a most delicate operation. They're off. Anderson on topside to release ballast to clear the hills. The 2 flyers reached the greatest height known to man, 14 miles. After 8 hours, they made an eggshell landing and brought back valuable knowledge on weather, cosmic rays, radio, and mapping. This was a remarkable expedition on the battlefront of science.
Weather conditions in the spring of 1936 produced unprecedented floods in the eastern states. To survey this national emergency, we dispatched the Army flagship, the Douglas C-32, fitted with the very latest communication equipment. Expert observers plotted the rescue work and sent out a call to the 2nd Bomb Group at Langley Field, Virginia. When the order was received, weather and intelligence officers briefed the crews for the emergency mission. 30 B-10 bombers, 45 officers, and nearly 100 enlisted men, under command of Major Robert Cronau, took part in this latest Air Corps effort to fight disaster. Flood damage was the greatest of record, as the B-10s flew over the swollen James, Potomac, Susquehanna, and Ohio rivers. Over the drop zones, 8,000 pounds of medicines, clothing, and food fell on isolated Pennsylvania communities. Thus, the Air Corps played a major role in alleviating human suffering at a time of great need by quickly converting its weapons of war to wings of mercy.
Meanwhile, Japan was still making a bid for world power with her undeclared war against China. We didn't know that by the end of 1937, Jap pilots were training for Pearl Harbor as her relatively modern Air Force ruled the sky over China. Other totalitarian nations like Italy were also testing their air forces in actual war on a scale unknown since 1918. Her soldiers and airmen were led into an unwarranted campaign of aggression against her helpless neighbor, Ethiopia, by Premier Benito Mussolini, an accomplished public rabble-rouser. In a country so primitive, there was no real opposition. To Mussolini's pilots, bomb strikes on native troops appeared like flowers bursting into bloom. The day he went before the League of Nations, Haile Selassie knew he would plead in vain. He stated that Italian aircraft had hurled gas and death upon his people and asked if the free world intended to bow before force. A few days later, the League of Nations went out of business.
That's when the American press started wondering why U.S. air power was falling so far behind Italy, France, Russia, and Britain. As a correspondent, I went to the War Department. Air Corps leaders showed me what they were doing with limited funds. I was surprised to find that working with American industry, the generals had started planning a long-range heavy bomber as early as 1933. Specifications had asked for an aerial dreadnought of tremendous capabilities. These requirements of speed, range, load, and ceiling had posed many problems for the designers. I discovered that among the models submitted was this revolutionary design from Boeing calling for 4 engines. If accepted, it would become a flying battleship, 68 feet long with a wingspan of 104 feet. Along with the model, Boeing engineers had prepared a detailed proposal which they submitted to the Materiel Division. Then I learned that in June 1934, Boeing received a contract from the Army for design data, a full-scale wooden mock-up, and complete wind tunnel tests on their proposal. Later, with many changes and suggestions, the Army Inspection Board approved construction of only one experimental plane. But so great was Boeing's faith in their idea, they borrowed money and staked their future on building the single B-17. Because this airplane was being constructed in competition, there was no financial support from the government. Instead, there is considerable skepticism and opposition. Therefore, it was strictly a pioneering venture, even to the wooden scaffolding and the custom-made parts and instruments. Building the first 4-engine bomber was a great gamble. No one would have thought that this maze of metal taking shape in the Boeing plant was to become one of the major weapons to fight for freedom a few years later. June 1935. The men who built her rolled the baby out into the sun. She looked magnificent. So good, they called her a flying fortress, and the name stuck. If she worked, the XB-17 would be the biggest single step toward advancement of American air power. Now, would the Army Air Corps accept her? The Giant was groomed and readied for a backbreaking test. At Seattle, the XB-17 pointed its sharp nose to the east and with a great surge of power soared into the air. Past Mount Rainier, the majestically sweeping design with feather-like maneuverability surpassed even the best hopes of its designers. The bomber flew the record-shattering 2,100 miles non-stop in exactly 9 hours at an average speed of 232 miles an hour. The basic Air Corps specifications were met as the plane came to rest at Wright Field, Ohio. For 2 months, Air Corps engineers tested the B-17. Few other planes were equally important in air history. Then came the day of the big test. October 30, 1935. And before the very eyes of the Army brass who had come to decide on it, high hopes were shaken.
Every one of us who had worked for the perfect defense weapon saw our creation go up in smoke. But Air Corps Chief General Westover immediately took up the battle. After several months of investigations, the plane was cleared of any mechanical fault. The B-17 could not be ignored because of an accident. More of these 4-engine bombers had to be built. Men and machines went back to work, and American air power marched on. Machinists, metal workers, small parts men, the skilled hands of America's great industrial wealth were back at their benches, performing millions of precision aviation tasks. A contract for construction of a service test fleet of 13 airplanes had been awarded the Boeing Company by far-sighted leaders of the Air Corps. Although this contract was completed with horse and buggy production methods, the dreams of men like Generals Westover and Andrews were being fulfilled. They claimed the airplane had brought into being a different mode of warfare, the application of air power. And with a B-17, they hoped to give America the weapon which could engage any enemy on land, sea, and in the air, destroy his war production and will to fight. However, it wasn't until spring 1937 that this new air power began to arrive, when the first B-17s were delivered to the 2nd Bomb Group.
The Air Corps was finally being equipped with weapons equal to any military planes in design, speed, endurance. Before the end of World War II, production increased 1,000-fold, giving us more than 12,000 flying fortresses. In later chapters, we shall see America's air power grow. And when the big test came in 1941, there was both a doctrine of air warfare and fully tested airplane designs in the strong hands of the United States Air Force. Late in 1937, the Army Air Corps prepared 6 flying fortresses for the famous Goodwill flight to South America. Special flying gear for 49 officers and men was inspected for the record-breaking mission. Finally, on February 17, 1938, engines were started and the B-17s began to rev up. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Olds signaled the planes to proceed individually over the route. In charge of the entire B-17 service test program, he devised this flight procedure for crew training. Rendezvousing at each day's objective, they engaged in the only formation flying of the trip. In this way, the navigational proficiency of the personnel was fully tested. After visiting Argentina, Chile, and Peru, the bombers returned to the United States and sat down at Langley Field, Virginia. The roster of the Goodwill pilots sounds like a roll call of America's World War II air leaders, because among them were Caleb V. Haynes, Harold L. George, and Curtis E. LeMay. Such missions were labeled the great expeditions of the first generation of human flight.
Later, Secretary of War Harry Woodring led a party of us, including Generals Arnold and Emmons, to honor the 2nd Bombardment Group. For achieving the most outstanding Army Air Corps flight of the year, we awarded them the highly prized Mackay Trophy. All 49 men were saluted for their high degree of skill in pilotage and navigation in accomplishing the 10,000-mile mission.
Meanwhile, with the advent of Hitler, the German Air Force came back to life. Glider clubs for Hitler youth were fostered throughout the fatherland. For the bigger boys, flying sports clubs were the attraction. First, Germany's aviation industry was ordered to build only commercial planes, easily convertible for military purposes. Then, ignoring the Versailles Treaty, Hitler gave Air Minister Goering the green light to go into mass production of fighters and bombers. America, the cradle of aviation, soon was outmanned and outplaned. We didn't seem to know that it took 1 year to train a pilot and 5 years to design and build a plane. Hermann Goering did. Hitler now had a powerful political weapon, and waxing Nazi aggressive ambition put it to use. Mechanized forces with 400 aircraft began to cross the Austrian border on March 11, 1938. Hitler himself followed the next day and formally swallowed up the Republic of Austria and its small air force, prelude to World War II.
As a result, Major General Frank Andrews gave us orders to put the nation's GHQ Air Force on defense maneuvers. In May 1938, the GHQ maneuvers utilized 3,000 officers and men, 217 military planes, and 19 temporary air bases, for a tactical exercise to defend the northeastern section of the U.S. against an air attack by American squadrons assuming the role of an enemy force. To assist General Andrews, we came from bases all over the country and aided him in planning the biggest show of its kind in the nation's air history. One of the highlights was to be a mock attack on the city of Farmingdale near Mitchell Field and a blackout of the area as the first U.S. air defense test. Weather intelligence as well as tower operations were alerted. Taking part was the small fleet of Boeing Fortresses, commanded by General Krogstad of the 2nd Wing. A few squadrons of Douglas B-18s, the new bomber favored by Congress and the Army, commanded by General Emmons of the 1st Wing, and several echelons of stubby P-26 fighters, which stepped down to treat New York's skyscrapers to an aerial thrill. Attacking bombers headed for the target, Farmingdale, home of the Seversky and Grumman aircraft plants. As night fell, newscasters like Bob Trout helped alert the defending planes of the 3rd Wing at Mitchell Field, as well as the surrounding Long Island community. At the first sound of approaching enemy aircraft, Farmingdale responded to the air raid signal with enthusiastic cooperation. The moment one plane was spotted, the detector picked up an entire squadron. They dropped flares instead of bombs, and with blank ammunition, the defenders hit back. The most realistic air exercises ever held were declared a brilliant success by the defending commander, General Martin, who lost the Battle of Farmingdale.
September 29, 1938, Hap Arnold became Chief of the Army Air Corps. With Andrews, he briefed General Marshall on the air facts of life. On the day following Arnold's appointment, the Munich Agreement was signed. Without firing a shot or dropping a bomb, Hitler's military machine had won for him a great victory. But Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain thought he had achieved peace. Peace in our time. The very next day, 500 German aircraft assisted in the invasion of the Sudetenland. By appeasement, Hitler had conquered Czechoslovakia. 6 months later, the Czech Republic was dissolved.
Munich taught America a great lesson. In international diplomacy, as in poker, you can't win if someone else holds all the aces. So in 1939, the Air Corps began to expand, to give the nation minimum air protection. And young Americans came to Texas to learn how to walk in the flight boots of air heroes like Thomas Selfridge, Eddie Rickenbacker, and Billy Mitchell. Thus, the training to build a manpower pool of reserve pilots began. Cadet requirements were rigid, and the course was tough. In fact, only 50% of each class made the grade. Within a few hours after his arrival, Mr. Cadet drew his uniforms, including white gloves, and was given a room, army blankets, and a rifle, which he learned to care for like a baby. Stern-faced and serious upperclassmen received their orders to guide the new flying cadets, whom they called dodos, through the intensive ground and aerial courses. Before the dodos learned to fly, they became soldiers. In 1 year, they had to absorb the Army's long tradition of service, honor, loyalty, and discipline, so that later they would know how to command. For the cadet was more than a prospective aviator. He was a potential officer in the Army Air Corps. For the academic phase of the life at Randolph Field, the Department of Ground Training provided the new cadet in the primary stage with intensive studies in meteorology, navigation, radio, and air regulations. In fact, all the knowledge necessary to become the best darn pilot in the world.
When we marched into the mess hall, we were anxious to hear the orders of the day. Classes which were promoted into basic training were announced by the cadet adjutant. The next morning, my new officer instructor was waiting for me when my class reported for duty. Those of us who weren't washed out thought we were pretty hot pilots. But soon after breaking ranks, we realized we had a lot to learn when we met a real flyer. We were about to spend a lot of time with this man and our new basic training plane, and we liked them both from the start. After flying primary trainers, the slick BT-9s looked like push-button flying jobs. We still didn't have to worry about retractable landing gear or armament, but now we did have to work flaps, trim tabs, operate radio, and other new devices. There was so much aerial activity at Randolph Field that some joker figured we used to fly 3 times around the Earth each day. Flying formations and cross-country, we covered more square miles than there are in the state of Texas. Although we had more instruments to watch, more complicated equipment to handle, flying was no longer a chore. It was fun, sport, excitement. And with every flight and every landing, the feeling grew. We talked and ate and slept flying. They say it costs thousands of dollars to train a pilot. Frankly, we should have paid the Army for the chance. Instead, we got $75 a month and the opportunity of a lifetime. After counting our pay, we got ready for weekend leaves. Life at Randolph wasn't all work. I'll never forget the big times in San Antonio where we rushed cadet widows, the name we gave to the local girls. For the spiritual and moral side of the student's character, the City of Wings had one of the most beautiful chapels in the Army. And to build his body, there were more than enough sports to choose from. One thing I bet none of us will ever forget was the calisthenics with rifles before breakfast.
For advanced training, we sent the fledgling flyer to nearby Kelly Field. There, he flew an AT-6. Although the 1939 Aviator was America's #1 idol, no longer was he a one-man show. That ended in 1918. Teamwork was the keynote for training, just as each cadet learned that it was the basis of all flying. The leader and his wingmen were a team, pilot and air crew, flyer and ground crew, because in this business, every man's life was always in the hands of a team. The Germans had their secret weapons. We had some ourselves. But the most valuable weapon in our entire arsenal was the self-reliant, resourceful American soldier. Accordingly, our cadets have always received more actual flying hours than any other nation. When the cadet brought his ship in for the last time, he was ready for graduation. With simple ceremonies, the cadets were sworn in and commissioned as second lieutenants in the Reserve Corps. Later, the graduates received their certificates and silver wings. Rigid and careful training had converted raw recruits into men mentally, morally, and physically fit to help defend the nation. Surrounded by their admiring families and friends, the cadets learned there were many rewards, personal as well as patriotic, for the best darned pilots in the world.
Keeping pace with the big national defense effort, pilot and other Army Air Corps training programs were marching forward to create air preparedness. When the new expansion program was finally put into operation during this prelude to war, the few hundred graduates of 1939 were but the vanguard of a great army of Americans learning to fly in defense of the United States. The goal of the Air Arm has not been to create a large standing army of service flyers, but rather to build up a reserve of trained personnel upon which it could call in times of national emergency. As we shall see in later chapters, 1939 was the birth of the belief that a strong Air Force would not only go a long way toward keeping America out of war, a strong Air Force would be absolutely vital in keeping war out of America. 1939. The United States, shocked by appeasement at Munich, had her leaders take a closer look at military aviation. While exploring the values of small bombers like the B-18 against the more costly Flying Fortress, they approved experimental projects for the B-15, whose 4 engines proved too weak for the giant's weight and wingspan of 149 feet, and for the lumbering B-19, which boasted a record span of 212 feet. However, both new ships did pay dividends in future bomber development.
It finally took world events to give the U.S. Air Force its biggest shot in the arm. On the fateful dawn of September 1st, 1939, Hitler directed the German army and Luftwaffe in a lightning-like campaign. The map was Poland. The plan was surprise. 20 years before, President Wilson had warned us that any future war will inevitably open with great aerial activity. Wilson was right. Without warning, 2,000 modern German combat planes took off for the first aerial blitz in the history of the world. Poland died on its airfields. With this earth-shattering overture played by strafing Stuka bombers, World War II began. Ironically, the method the Germans followed in this Polish campaign was the same one by which we, on a far larger scale, would defeat Germany. As thousands of bombs demolished Polish cities, the U.S. Air Corps learned a lesson. Now Hitler's threat, today Germany, tomorrow the world, was both believed and feared.
In the United States, the president proclaimed a national emergency.
We immediately put a huge expansion program into operation. It took no time at all before we ran out of facilities, as we raised air crew and other training goals. From an all-volunteer corps of 23,000 in 1939, we grew 100-fold as more volunteers and draftees joined up. Science helped us choose their specialties. There were physical as well as mental requirements for the hundreds of skills which we eventually taught to 2.5 million men and women who became our ground and air crews. We measured a man's oxygen needs as well as his muscular and mental coordination. We devised mechanical aptitude tests and general classification tests which indicated ability to learn in the many technical categories. As General Arnold declared, the Air Corps had to become the largest single educational organization in a very short time. We were an army of specialists. In schools all over the country, we learned our trades from experts and became airplane mechanics, cooks and bakers, communications men, bombardiers, armorers, meteorologists. We learned hundreds of technical jobs, and finally we were a tremendous team of skilled Americans who knew how to keep them flying.
America's ability to mass-produce complex military aircraft was essentially a civilian miracle. However, in 1940, as in 1917, defense work didn't get started until late. War had stopped the wheels of industry, and conversion took time, valuable time. Many factors made the miracle possible. Waiting airplane designs, inexhaustible raw materials and highly adaptable industry, a variety of well-established aviation companies, willing defense workers, and a goal.
I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year.
Many said this was impossible, but the new models were ready. B-25 Mitchell by North American. P-38 Lightning by Lockheed. B-26 Marauder by Martin. P-39 Air Cobra by Bell. B-24 Liberator by Consolidated. And P-40 Kitty Hawk by Curtiss. But 50,000 aircraft meant speeding up from 2,000 planes a year to more than 4,000 planes per month. Could America do it?
when German forces, led by her Luftwaffe, began to overrun the map of Europe early in 1940, across Denmark and Norway, then southward, speeding over Holland and Belgium toward France, I, as a military observer, filed my reports. The air war that everyone feared had, in fact, started. The smirking Luftwaffe was repeating its Polish success as it paved the way for advancing panzers which crushed 3.5 million French soldiers. While German troops and airmen goose-stepped on the heart of Paris, the Luftwaffe was invincible. But the triumphs of 1939 and 40 had all been scored against weak opposition. After the French surrender, June 22nd, only the RAF remained for the Luftwaffe to conquer. A test of strength soon came, the battle for Britain. The Luftwaffe set to its task of controlling all Western Europe by crossing the Channel. German engines forecast a rain of death. The RAF was ready but outnumbered. Warned of the approaching attack, their fighter command sprang to the task of trying to hold off the invasion. While Britain's spotters and warning centers tracked the enemy planes, I watched the island's defenses go into action. The outnumbered few fought back with more than blood, sweat, and tears. They had Spitfires and Hurricanes in their aircraft arsenal and a modest but well-trained force of airmen. The best that Goering had to offer was knocked out of the sky. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered 2-1, fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill and chased them back across the Channel. Then Britain's warning centers reported that Goering switched to night raids. London was still the main target, but the people had learned to take it. Although slowed down by ground and air defenses, the Luftwaffe's final effort was desperate. Her repeated night raids on southern ports and shipping were furious, but Britain was saved.
Out of the London Blitz came new cooperation with friendly nations for U.S. air defense. The President revealed an agreement transferring 50 overage destroyers to Great Britain in exchange for the right to establish air and naval bases at 8 key points. We received 99-year leases on sites in Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Antigua, Trinidad, and British Guiana. For bases such as these, late in 1941, Army engineers began to practice building airfields in a hurry, a job they eventually did all around the world. At the Louisiana and Carolina maneuvers, steel carpets for airplanes were tried with excellent results. Air leaders call these landing mats the year's greatest achievement in aviation. Rivalry between Air Commanders William Kepner and Asa Duncan was keen, and every effort was made to simulate actual war conditions as they existed in Europe at the moment. Except that Hitler didn't use sacks of flour. High point of the maneuver was the lesson learned from the first large-scale use of American airplanes to move armies. On November 22nd, the fleet of C-47s unloaded a complete battalion of airborne infantry to help capture Pope Field, North Carolina. In the sham battle that followed, all the new planes distinguished themselves. Attesting to the gains made during the years of experimental flight, technical advance, expanding man and machine power, the nation's air arm was being prepared for grueling events now only days ahead.
December 6, 1941, Honolulu. Although alerted, the city went about its business in the usual way. December 6, 1941, Hamilton Field, California. We were under orders to get every available B-17 to the Philippine Islands. General Arnold personally inspected the air movement of the 13 B-17s. They carried no armament because of the heavy gas load necessary for the 3,000-mile hop to Oahu.
Dawn, December 7, 1941, the Pacific Ocean. A Japanese task force was also heading for Oahu. Mission, sneak attack. Primary targets, Pearl Harbor and Hickam Field. Exactly at 0600, the fateful signal was given. And the first wave, 200 fighters, horizontal bombers, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers roared off. Pearl was an ideal target because through greater fear of sabotage than air attack, ships and planes had been brought together rather than dispersed.
When the B-17s from California finally approached the island, their engines were heard by some of our men at Pearl and Hickam. At the same instant, from another direction, the Japs struck. In the midst of the onslaught, the unarmed B-17s arrived. Our pilots could do no more than find a place to land.
Wave after wave of enemy planes bombed American aircraft and units of the Pacific Fleet in a treacherous attack which achieved perfect tactical surprise.
Other Japs went after U.S. fighters on auxiliary fields. In spite of the terrific pounding, our pilots and mechanics were able to get 4 P-40s and 2 P-36s in the air within the first 30 minutes and offer some resistance. In the face of overwhelming odds, Lieutenants Harry Brown, Robert Rogers, Kenneth Taylor, John Webster, and George Welch, among many others, fought back as best they could. At the end of the single air attack, the United States had suffered a crushing blow, and the nation was at war.
The Jap squadrons returned to their carriers with a loss of only 49 planes, a cheap price for so great a victory. Although America had paid heavily for being unprepared, the U.S. Air Force, led by men like Hap Arnold, began to rise from the disaster.
We are faced with a tough job, but I know that we can do it. And with all due reverence, I say, by God, we will do it.
(1941). 24 hours after the date that will live in infamy, the nation assembled to hear their commander-in-chief.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Bombs from enemy planes had finally brought national unity. Fortunately, to lead the war effort, we had men like Mr. Robert Lovett, Assistant Secretary of War for Air, Judge Robert Patterson, Under-Secretary of War, Chief of the Army Air Forces, General Henry Arnold, heading a staff which included Carl Spaatz, James Doolittle, Ira Aker, and Hoyt Vandenberg, among others. And one of America's leading advocates for expanded air power, Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He checked U.S. outposts like General Frank Andrews' Caribbean Defense Command. In charge of Army forces in the Far East was the man who had helped us establish the GHQ Air Force, General Douglas MacArthur. Now he consulted with Manuel Quezon, President of the Philippines. Together they had kept the island secure after a week of heavy bombing by the Japanese. Mac's men, close to a knockout, rolled with a punch.
Not so at Clark Field. Here, despite a 9-hour warning, half our total bombing force was lost on the ground. But this didn't stop the Far East Air Force on emergency fields from wiring its planes together to fight what was destined to be a losing battle. Fighter pilots like Joseph Moore, Grant Mahoney, and Samuel Merritt fought a delaying action. Never knowing if their temporary bases would be safe for return, they prepared to engage the enemy. Few B-17s that escaped destruction joined the fight. Distinguishing themselves were bomber pilots Rosie O'Donnell, Hewitt Wheelis, and Kelly. That's Captain Colin Kelly. His fortress had been directed to locate and sink a carrier. Instead, a Jap heavy cruiser was spotted. A warship made a good target for Kelly's bombardier, Meyer 11. The bombs damaged and stopped the warship.
Colin Kelly's life came to a hero's end that morning. Meyer 11's luck ran out over New Guinea a year later. And despite the heroic sacrifices of men like Kelly and Levin, the Japs finally drove the Allies out of the Philippines. In Australia, where we had to concentrate our limited air strength after retreating from the islands, our job was to stop the Japs from sweeping over all the Pacific. With this in mind, we had to deploy our forces for the defense of Australia early in 1942. That's why General Ralph Royce, Chief of Pacific Air Staff, piloted his new boss, General George Brett, Chief of Allied Air Forces in the Pacific, on an aerial inspection tour. General Brett decided his air units must encompass the entire continent of Australia.
All this time, there was an American volunteer group in Asia. Here, Special Advisor to the Chinese Air Force, Claire Chennault, had 84 volunteer pilots, including men such as Tex Hill, George Burgard, and Robert Smith. Nicknamed the Flying Tigers, their P-40 Tomahawks were serviced by Chinese mechanics and 200 American ground crewmen. Along with official sanction, the former Army, Navy, and Marine pilots were offered $600 per month and the promise of a bonus for every Jap plane destroyed. A few days after Pearl Harbor, the Flying Tiger 1st and 2nd Squadrons moved to Kunming. There, Chennault set up a fighter control headquarters, hooked into an elaborate air warning net to receive reports from Chinese aircraft spotters. The Japanese, based at Hanoi, 60 miles away, headed for Kunming to destroy the untried Tigers who had arrived only the day before. The moment the Jap flight was airborne, a sharp-eyed Chinese spotter ran to flash the warning. Crude red lantern semaphores sent the signal over the hill. Kunming had experienced many false alerts, but this report of heavy engine noise at station X-10 was the real thing. Fighter control added up the enemy course and placed them 50 miles east of Kunming. This was the decisive moment. The Tigers weren't going to lose any planes on the ground. Kunming wasn't going to be another Pearl Harbor or Clark Field. Japs were about to feel the bite of these razor-teeth tiger sharks, terrifying emblem of the Flying Tigers. And so, American pilots in American planes, aided by a primitive Chinese warning system, were about to tackle a formation of the Imperial Japanese Air Force, which was then victoriously sweeping the Pacific skies. Part of the fate of China was riding in the P-40 cockpits as Robert Sandel's first squad made contact with the enemy. After losing 60% of their force in this one fight, the Japs never again tried to bomb Kunming. Chennault's handful of Flying Tigers were our only fighting airmen in China. And like the Lafayette Escadrille in World War I, they made us proud.
But for global war, we needed men, thousands of skilled men. Some had to become bombardiers and learn the intricacies of complex gadgets like the secret bomb sights. Working mock-ups, machine guns mounted on platforms and trucks, trained gunners to draw a bead on a flashing target. Then the training took to the skies. Behind each gun was a man, and behind each man was months of training. The lives of a crew were going to depend on the accuracy of the gunner. By February 1942, tail guns were filling the blind spot that lost us Colin Kelly. The Axis took 10 years to build their air forces. America had to do it in one, and at the same time hold off the enemy.
On the President's order, the bitter taste of war was returned to Japan. We fashioned a daring scheme to have the Hornet launch a force of bombers and strike at Tokyo from the sea. All the volunteers for this secret and hazardous job had been specially trained by Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. While under destroyer escort, the 80 Tokyo Raiders held a deck ceremony with Japanese medals. Doolittle fastened one of these to a 500-pound bomb. The medals were going to be returned with interest. Lashed to the flight deck, the 16 B-25s had a rough voyage. Hoping to reach a takeoff point 450 miles from Japan, but ready to start in event of discovery, the crews kept fit. They were discovered. After avoiding 2 enemy patrol vessels, the task force realized they were sighted by a Japanese picket boat. The Hornet's escort promptly sank. Since secrecy had been compromised and fearing an alarm all over Japan, Doolittle, forced into the decision, ordered the planes to be launched. This was 800 instead of 450 miles from Tokyo, and 10 hours earlier than planned. In spite of the last-second change, preparations went according to rehearsal. Only 467 feet of clear deck faced Doolittle's lead ship. The rest barely had room in which to rev up, and the last plane hung precariously out over the stern of the Hornet. After the wind-up by the flight officer, Doolittle made his run down the plunging deck. With 100 feet to spare, he led the parade. Tension eased a little once the colonel was in the air. Crewmen cheered as one plane after another screamed down the swaying runway. In the excitement, this pilot started without lowering his flaps. His plane ran off the deck, dropped sharply, but expert piloting saved it. Launching fully loaded medium bombers had never been done before. When the decks of the flagship were cleared, Admiral Halsey signaled, "To Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command, good luck and God bless you."
Tokyo, oddly enough, had just completed an air raid drill. Their patrol boat had warned the city, but the attack was expected the next day. Therefore, the Jap war machine rolled on, unmindful of the approaching eagles. Target factories were turning out munitions tagged for Corregidor, Midway, and Dutch Harbor. Secure behind their Pacific fortress, and confident of an early victory, they discounted America's ability to fight back.
Thus, the bombers were virtually unopposed as they flew on the deck. They swept in over the coast on their way to Tokyo. Elements separated and some climbed to 1,500 feet for the bombing. At 12:15, the attack was opened by Doolittle, who dove in before he unloaded his incendiaries upon the Japanese capital. One after another, they checked off their targets. Tank factory, shipyard, docks, railroad yards, steel plant, gunpowder factory.
As the raiders left Tokyo with a broad trail of flame and smoke in their wake, Japan tasted war. The raid was but an omen of the eventual destruction to be heaped on Japan from the skies. As Doolittle later promised,
We're going back to Tokyo, and we shall go in full array and with mighty allies.
Spring 1942. The Axis was winning the war, and the Allies faced their gravest crisis as Nazi and Japanese officers met in Germany. If their victories continued, and as yet there was no force to stop them, the Axis powers hoped their armies would victoriously meet in Asia, just as their tacticians met for maneuvers. Each greedy for immediate conquests, they planned to completely dominate the world. In those black days of 1942, German armies and air forces pushed toward Japan. Relentlessly, the gigantic Axis pincers were threatening to close in Central Asia.
That's why American industry doubled and quadrupled its war effort. There was definite hope for victory, provided the British and Russian people could give the United States time to supply our allies and time to build an air force which could smash the Axis pincers. It wasn't long when the Truman Committee was able to state, "We have succeeded in building up an air industry in the U.S. which our foes cannot hope to equal."
But planes alone were not enough, and so specialized training began in 1942 under the watchful eye of Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He saw the 82nd Airborne Flying Foot Soldiers change from a brave dream into a deadly fighting machine under command of General Matthew Ridgway. The 1st Air Troop Carrier Unit had been set up by the AAF to work with paratroopers. The amazing success of the Germans had awakened belated American interest in vertical envelopment, which means landing a combat force behind enemy lines. Reliable C-47s were quickly boarded by the shock troops who were going to spearhead the way for a glider army which would follow. They were about to test tactical principles in North Carolina before going overseas to help blunt the Axis pincers. For all the great airborne operations of the war, American troop carrier men and planes provided most of the lift. There was nothing new about an airborne army. Billy Mitchell had received approval for such an operation during World War I. But even he never dreamed of entire armies filling the skies. In theory, the American paratroopers dropped on surprise defenders and seized bridgeheads for the gliders.
On other airfields, towcraft, modified C-47 Skytrains, hitched on troop carrier gliders which were loaded and ready. Nylon, the new strong synthetic, was science's answer to the tow rope problem. Once hooked together, the transport towed the glider into position for the takeoff run. This made room for another Skytrain. On a split-second schedule, they were like so many locomotives taking on freight cars. Some Skytrains hauled double freights. Taxiing at full throttle, the tow planes had to remain on the ground until the ton-and-a-half gliders were airborne. Once over the drop zone, glider pilots cut their ships loose to play their special part in the pattern of attack. Banking sharply away, they dove for the ground. Quickest possible landing kept the unarmed gliders from being easy game for enemy fighters. As more cut loose and headed down to the spinning earth, the glider army joined the paratroopers who had set up points of resistance. Thus, the AAF gave the infantry wings, and the weapon, vertical envelopment, became a reality.
Another weapon in America's arsenal for global war was the skill and experience of our great commercial airlines operating under contract to the War Department. July 1942, this ferrying service was reorganized as the Air Transport Command under veteran flyer General Harold George. In the company of C.R. Smith, his deputy, they inspected new installations. By summer, ATC routes touched all 6 continents. The growth of the Air Transport Command closely paralleled the expansion of the Air Force itself. In less than 2 years, sky bridges connected practically every corner of the world. ATC Skywagons, guided by the Army Airways communications system, crossed the Atlantic on an average of 1 every 13 minutes. The broader Pacific, every hour and a half. And so ATC, by supplying both men and machines to world battlefronts, was preparing to smash the Axis threat.
During these critical early days, the Navy succeeded in breaking the Japanese secret code. On May 15th, Navy intelligence officers intercepted an important communication. It was the detailed Jap plan to attack Midway and points in the Aleutians with an invasion army supported by a tremendous task force. But if the Japs knew that we had broken their code, this could have been a wild goose chase or a trap. The Army and Navy decided to gamble. If we could intercept the Jap Navy at Midway, the payoff was too great to overlook. And so the call went out. ATC had to deliver reinforcements, bombs and ammunition to the Aleutians and B-17s to Midway. The Hawaiian Department had to beg, borrow, and steal these bomber aircraft from our slim Pacific forces. The B-17s committed to this mission were led by Lieutenant Colonels Walter Sweeney and Brooke Allen. Every last plane would be needed for the impending battle. Once down on Midway after the long flight, with no rest, our crews had to be thrown into immediate patrol duty.
The Japanese fleet, more than 80 warships, advanced. The coded message was authentic. Their task forces divided, some steaming north toward Alaska, the main body converging on Midway. 470 miles west of the island, the battle stage was set when a Navy Catalina spotted the strong enemy task force. But Midway's commander refused to commit American naval or air units until he had more information about the enemy.
Our newly arrived B-17s and B-26s, as well as Marine fighters, were under constant alert. We installed extra gas tanks to increase bomber range. Our crewmen realized that this was going to be the first test of B-17s as a defensive weapon against attacking surface forces. Some big bomber boys even claimed that B-17s could stop carriers. The 4th of June was the day of the real battle. Minutes after a patrol sighted the enemy, those bombers not yet in the air got going fast. 9 B-17 crews under Colonel Sweeney were joined by 5 from Colonel Allen's squadron. Warmed up and ready for battle, Air Force bombers took off to find the enemy. Rendezvous point was Curie Island, from where our bombers were to proceed west to the target. 100 miles out, our bomber commanders received new orders to change course and go after an enemy carrier force that had broken away from the main fleet and was now launching an attack against our base.
The Japanese dagger, pointed at Midway, was made up of 4 carriers, great battle wagons, many destroyers and transports. The mission of the Imperial carrier planes was to rake the island's gun emplacements and bomb the way for an invasion. Marine Vindicators sprang to meet the enemy, and the battle was on.
In the heat of battle, our flag was struck down. Marines quickly repaired the broken staff and ceremoniously raised Old Glory against the backdrop of fire, smoke, and faith. Units of the U.S. Navy, including 3 flat tops, had raced up to Midway. Navy fighters and bombers were wound up and sent off while the Japs were still pounding U.S. defenses. Enemy destroyers and cruisers were the target. Our marauders and fortresses went after enemy carriers. Jap units were like huge magnets attracting Navy planes, Marine dive bombers, and AAF heavies. One B-17 found his target and leveled off. Jap units and American bombers joined the battle. This Jap Betty got through our barrage. It was a free-for-all. Finally, when our Navy and Air Force bombers hammered back at Jap carriers, the issue was decided. First, our bombers attacked from 3,600 feet and then came down to strafe the decks. One by one, the enemy ships caught fire. During the 3-day battle, aside from 8 auxiliary vessels sunk or damaged, Japan lost 4 carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, and 3 destroyers, in addition to 275 aircraft and 4,800 men. We had smashed the Jap dagger.
Back at the base, now free from the threat of invasion, the men dug themselves out of the wreckage. A Navy PBY, which had rescued a ditched B-17 crew, now brought them home. The battle ended with Midway's installations, including the hospital, badly wrecked by enemy bombers. Unified under one flag, sailors, Marines, and airmen who had fought side by side now saluted the 92 officers and 215 enlisted men we had lost. All were heroes. In the Battle of Midway, perhaps the most important single engagement of the Pacific Naval War, the airplane at last proved itself a defensive weapon against attacking surface forces. Once again, the AAF had demonstrated its ability to meet the enemy on land, on sea, and in the air. It was planned destiny that the Axis pincers would suffer the crushing blows of the greatest striking force in military history, the United States Air Force.
First pictures of the famous Yankee Flying Tigers in China. For many months, their bullets held open the Burma Road, beating a deadly tattoo upon the planes of Japan's Air Force. Former Army, Navy, Marine officers, transport pilots, they're the last of the world's soldiers of fortune. Today, they're a part of America's flying forces fighting the Battle of China. Volunteering before the United States entered the war, these amazing young men have astounded the world with their deeds of heroism and daring. Their leader, 50-year-old General Claire Chennault, for 5 years advisor to the Chinese Air Force. His knowledge of Japanese aerial tactics he passed along to his American volunteers. Taking off from airfields literally paved by hand, the Tigers score for their first 90 days of fighting 470 Jap planes for 15 of the volunteers. 50 grinning Tiger Shark planes, wired together with spare parts from 50 more, were all they had to start with. Fighting in teams of 2, they concentrate their firepower. One reason for their amazing success against seemingly impossible odds. General Chennault mapping the aerial raids the Japs fear above all, American Flying Tigers. physical exercise is an important phase in the training of U.S. aerial gunners. Strong arms and strong hands are needed to fire the powerful guns of a bomber. Hands and fingers that must be quick on the trigger. Blindfolded, they learn to take apart and reassemble each weapon. Climbing aboard a fast fighter plane, they're ready for the final test aloft. Guns equipped with camera instead of bullets to check the accuracy of their aim. Flying in formation, the gunners see the enemy exactly as they would from the tail of a bomber. Their job is to protect their ship from assault by diving fighters like this. Score one, and when they land, the camera guns tell the story. American bombers assemble at a secret aerodrome somewhere along the northern tip of Australia. The order of the day, attack. General Royce and General Scanlon in command. One by one, the huge ships take off. Weeks of planning, months of training, now put to the test. Fast pursuit planes roar down the strip and zoom aloft at incredible speed. These are the fighters of the air fleet. Daily they go up, and daily they land. From the looks of the bullet holes, some of them have made contact with the enemy. Battle scars that show that American ships are built to take plenty of punishment. Credited with staving off the invasion of Australia, these young pilots know their business. Here's one coming in now. His landing gear jammed by Japanese bullets. He's forced to make a crash landing. Dangerous with any ship, doubly so with a bomber. And he does a perfect job. All hands aboard safe and sound. The pilot is congratulated by the general and mentioned in official dispatches. Only a few repairs are necessary, and the ship will soon be ready to fly again. A thrilling example of how American airmen are rapidly winning the mastery of the skies. $70 tons of airplane. The U.S. Navy's new $2.5 million experimental flying boat, Mars, now ready for her maiden flight. Capable of flying the Atlantic and back without stopping for fuel, the mighty Mars is a forerunner of things to come. The contrast between a Navy patrol bomber and the giant amphibian is striking. 4 monster motors, each with more power than a locomotive. Armed to the teeth, planes like the Mars can speed men and weapons to the battlefronts of the world in a matter of hours. These are some of the U.S. Army flyers who bombed Tokyo. General Doolittle, who led the raid, sees General Arnold, Army Air Chief, decorate 23 of his men with the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation states, they volunteered for this mission, knowing full well that the chances of survival were extremely remote. But they did survive, and they're ready to go again. Biggest reward is the family reunion. And here's where the U.S. Army trained some of those flyers. Ground school for bombardiers. On rolling platforms equipped with practice bomb sights, they learn the secrets of expert marksmanship, study the outlines of potential targets. Now they're ready to take real bombs aloft for an actual test. Student pilots at the controls, student bombardiers on the alert. Their objective, outline of a city, drawn to scale. Down go the bombs, sped to their target by the finest bomb sight in the world. Again they let go. No command needed now. This is the Bombardier's big moment. Sample of United Nations air power in action on the battlefronts of the world. Beneath a battery of electric fans, Texas fighter pilots don fur-lined clothing for a flight into the sub-zero temperature of the stratosphere. On the ground, it's a sizzling 110 degrees. And in these Eskimo outfits, that's hot in any language. Called Satan's Angels, these hand-picked steel-nerved crews have the toughest job in the Air Force. Schooled in high-altitude fighter tactics, their battlefields are thousands of feet above the earth. Executing perfect teamwork, they play a grim, exciting game of follow the leader through ethereal clouds in a world all their own. Flying machine gun nests peeling off into space. Satan's Angels, death diving for Uncle Sam. The famous American Kitty Hawk fighters are gaining quite a name for themselves with Australian aces. Here at a secret base somewhere down under, veterans of campaigns over England and the Middle East give fledglings a demonstration of what the Kitty Hawks really can do. Taking off from runways hewn from the jungle, they roar aloft. The camera plane recording their dramatic flight in aviation scenes rarely equaled. High above the clouds, they gather in the tight formation pursuit planes use for safety, quadrupling their firepower as they dive to the attack. Victory roll, the flyer's signal to his home field that he has met and downed an enemy plane in combat. Now, swooping across the aerodrome at incredible speeds, they stage a show that in peacetime would be sensational. Today, it's all a part of the grim, deadly job of war. Australian aces writing history in the skies. Flying Tigers, the famous American volunteer group, wing their way across China for the last time as volunteers. For 8 months, these Chinese signs have been the only insignia of the most spectacular and efficient fighting force in aviation history. Now, wearing the emblem of their native land, the U.S. Air Force, they become regular officers with American flying forces fighting in China. A Jap flag for every plane shot down. 200 in less than 4 months. Leader of the volunteers, Brigadier General Chennault, now promoted to command all American flying forces in China. Here he outlines the field of operations. With flags and souvenirs, a grateful Chinese people pay simple tribute to the airmen who have done so much to clear the skies over their embattled land. Clearing the skies for much-needed supplies. Supplies which in turn are exchanged for the valuable raw products of China. Losing no time, the new command plots the strategy of attack. By an elaborate far-flung system of Chinese listening posts, word is flashed, Japanese planes on the way, and the red ball goes up over the field. Signal for pilots to take to their ships. The Flying Tigers going into action for the first time in the uniforms of Uncle Sam. Newly assigned pilots go with the veterans. Schooled in the fighting tactics, Chenot has proven superior. Roaring aloft, they seek the enemy, their flying generals still at the controls. The new American Air Force over China, carrying on the tradition of the famous Flying Tigers. Aboard a United States aircraft carrier somewhere at sea, Army P-40s, Tomahawks, or Kitty Hawks, the British call them, are now ferried to within flying range of their new bases, all ready for action. Army pilots who'll take them ashore get last-minute instructions. Wheeled to the flight deck, the speedy fighters are ready for the takeoff. Part way by carrier, then the pilots deliver them the rest of the way. Getting them into the air requires real flying skill. Cooperation between the armed forces. Navy carriers speeding Army planes and pilots to United Nations bases overseas.